Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of PODIO Commentary. I'm your host, Matt Jarbo, and today we're going to be diving in to one of my all-time favorite childhood movies. This is one that, look, when we think about the success of video game movies, we oftentimes think about it in reverse. Nothing really is successful overall. I mean, think about it. Has there ever really been a video game movie that has been deemed as being super successful and a true adaptation of the source material? No. The closest thing we have nowadays is Free Guy, but it's like an adaptation of the video game concept, and maybe Ready Player One, which again is also very similar. A lot of these movies are just bad in some cases, and they're mediocre in others. We chalk this up generally to Hollywood producers simply not knowing how to adapt video games in a way that casual audiences want to see, that will also appease hardcore fans. However, there are always the failures that make the what not to do list for future adaptations, and honestly, 1993's Super Mario Bros. Movie is number one on that list. While I in no way think that this is the worst video game movie ever made, Resident Evil 5 comes to mind. And I also don't think that many other old school gamers feel that way either. This movie is, for better or worse, an unmitigated disaster from the get-go. And its production history is one that is frequently mentioned amongst movie historians. The Bob Hoskins-led film was one that the 11-year-old me could not wait to see. And nearly 30 years later, I still absolutely adore the movie. But today on PODIO Commentary, I wanted to run through the troubled production history of the film and see just how bad things really were. So, let's dive in. Back in 1990, Super Mario Bros. 3 released for the NES in the United States, and it sold 250,000 copies right off the bat. This was due to the love of the franchise with young gamers, as well as the success of the 90-minute commercial for the game that was 1989's The Wizard, which is another movie that I love. Eventually, the game went on to earn over $500 million in just the US alone, and that was in early 1990s money, which is worth actually a lot more than now. So suffice it to say, the game was actually pretty popular. So when it comes to the movie itself, it all stems from a suggestion from a man by the name of Roland Joffe. He did this during a meeting with his production company called Leitmotiv. Joffe, at the time, was really only known for the films The Killing Fields and The Mission. Those are two films he directed. He was basically known as a war movie director before producing Mario Brothers. In fact, this was Joffe's first attempt at being a producer, and he was fully aware of it. But this quote here kind of outlines some of what went wrong down the line when he says, "I hope to be the kind of producer I'd want as a director. As a producer, I don't intrude. I suggest and guide by asking questions. Sometimes I find my voice in this very technological film is the one that's asking, yes, but what about the character? What does the audience feel? And it's a learning process for me to ask them." Joffe had good intentions. This much is true. But a producer coming at it from a director mindset maybe wasn't the best, as we'll learn as we go on. From there, Joffe went and met with Nintendo of America president Minoru Arakawa. Now, Arakawa was the son-in-law of Nintendo's president Hiroshi Yamauchi, and it was here where he presented Arakawa with the initial draft of the script. A month later, Joffe went to Nintendo's headquarters in Kyoto to meet with Hiroshi Yamauchi himself. He pitched Yamauchi the storyline, which led to Nintendo receiving some interest in the project. Joffe actually was able to convince them that he was the guy to take over control of the Mario character, and to sweeten the deal, he paid Nintendo $2 million for the rights. But Nintendo was able to retain all merchandising rights, which, let's be fair, in a situation like this, that is where the true money is going to come from. The reason why Nintendo let Joffe buy the rights for such a low price tag was that they actually had no interest in making movies. They felt that the Mario brand was strong enough to withstand pretty much anything. And they were right, to be fair. In retrospect, they were absolutely right. Joffe also said that he felt that Nintendo felt that the movie was a bit of a strange creature and they wanted to see whether it could work or not. So they really approached it from more of an experimental perspective, which is fascinating to say the least. Now, the first screenplay for the movie was actually written by Oscar-winning screenwriter Barry Morrow, and his story followed the Mario brothers on an existential road trip that was similar to Morrow's prior Rain Man. I mean, we're talking so similar that the nickname Drain Man was actually applied to the script. Yeah, that's a pretty groan-inducing pun, but you can see why it didn't really last. Morrow here described his screenplay as a study in contrast like Laurel and Hardy or Abbott and Costello, and that would have more of an odyssey and a quest, like the game itself, which is interesting. But co-producer Fred Caruso later said that Morrow's story was more of a serious drama piece as opposed to a fun comedy. Then screenwriters Jim Genuine and Tom S. Parker were brought in to write a more traditional adaptation. And they said, so right away we knew that the best way to do this is to essentially have a journey into this world, not unlike The Wizard of Oz. Their take on this was actually more to subvert fairy tale cliches and satirize them, as well as focus on the relationship between Mario and Luigi. Later on, Genuine said that they approached this very similar to Shrek, which I can only assume means with the fairy tale cliches and the satirization of them. But then they also went on to say that this story was about the brothers. And I'm curious if that has anything to do with the relationship between Shrek and Donkey. I know it not maybe the most apt comparison, but that's kind of what I'm going for based upon this quote. Now, when Jaffe needed a director, he looked at Greg Beeman, who did License to Drive a couple years prior, the popular Corey Haim and Corey Feldman movie. And they actually attached him to direct, as development in Super Mario Bros. Had already moved the film into pre-production. However, Beeman's failure with Mom and Dad Save the World led to the dismissal by nervous producers. That movie is pretty bad, but it's like funny bad. And apparently it tanked so terribly, it got him booted from the movie. And that's pretty sad. It might have actually been a different movie overall, but then would it be as much of a cult classic? Who knows? But this is where it gets interesting. From here, Jaffe actually went directly to Harold Ramis and offered the director position. And even though Harold Ramis was a big fan of the video game, he declined, which he would later reflect as being basically the smartest career decision he ever made. And that's saying something, because year one was a movie. This is, however, when Jaffe started to really think outside of the box. He needed something crazy enough to work, and he started thinking about the cult character of Max Headroom. And that seemed like the right idea, the right direction to take this movie at the time. So Jaffe decided he would travel to Rome, and he met with the creators of Max Headroom, Rocky Morton and Annabel Jankel. Morton said that they come from the Tim Burton School of Filmmaking because their background is in animation and comic books. So they started basing everything in reality and then tried to have fun with it and exaggerate it as much as possible. And if you remember how Dino Hatton looked in the movie, it kind of feels like that was the approach they're going for. So Jaffe, Morton, and Jankel decided to approach this adaptation very similarly to 1989 Batman and 1990s Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles by playing into the darker tone. And keep in mind, both of those films were wildly popular. And if you ever notice that there might be a bit of a pendulum shift back towards the darker, maybe that was a couple years ago, but who knows? Anyway, Jaffe here said that this wasn't Snow White and the Seven Dinosaurs. The dino world was dark and we didn't want to hold back. To which case I have to say, this was a bright colored kids game. You know, in retrospect, maybe the dark, dank world, not the best. Morton, however, described the film as a prequel to the video games that tells the true story behind Nintendo's inspiration. Jaffe viewed the games as a mixture of Japanese fairy tales and bits of modern America, and he wanted to create a slightly mythic version of New York. Screenwriter Parker Bennett then went on to elaborate here that our take on it was that Nintendo interpreted the events from our story and then came up with the video game. We basically worked backwards. Kind of a bad idea, but all right. Now, the concept of the parallel universe inhabited by dinosaurs was inspired by Dinosaur Land from the recently released Super Mario World. Jankel envisioned the parallel dimension as a whole world with a reptile point of view, dominated by aggressive primordial behavior and basic instincts. While Morton considered the ecological and technological consequences of a dinosaur society that holds fossil fuels sacred, Jaffe went on to say that it's a wonderful parody of New York and heavy industry. We call it new brutalism. You can already kind of see, again, more of the problems here just right off the get-go. And then screenwriters Parker Bennett and Terry Runté were then tasked with taking this concept and balancing comedy with the darker tone, where they actually based Ghostbusters as the model, and they were aiming towards funny but kind of weird and dark. And in retrospect, I kind of get that approach to the movie. You know, Ghostbusters was a working man's comedy, that the comedy came from the actors and characters responding to the world around them, but still treating it as if it was real. Here, something was very similar to that when Mario and Luigi go in to the dino world. I get that. But you can also kind of see where they missed the mark entirely. Despite working well with the directors, Bennett and Runté were dismissed by the producers for being too comedic, and a British writing team were brought in to deliver a more adult and feminist tone. During this new take, Princess Daisy and Lena's roles were expanded, while Bertha, a big black woman, was introduced. When that version of the script was done, the film did move into pre-production. It was at this point, though, that the producers feared that the project had skewed a bit too far from the intended young adult family audiences and had become a bit too effects heavy to film within the budget. So without informing the directors, they actually signed a new set of screenwriters, Ed Solomon and Ryan Rowe, to provide a more family-friendly script with restrained effects requirements. This script doctoring was actually motivated by Disney purchasing the film's distribution rights. And here's where it's crazy. The cast and crew only discovered the new screenplay upon arriving in Wilmington, North Carolina. Oddly enough, the script that got the cast signed on was the previous one written with the more feminist tone. And the bait and switch is not necessarily something that was truly uncommon for this kind of project. It happened pretty frequently, it felt like. However, when it came to casting, after securing the rights to the film, Leitmotiv went to work trying to find the right cast of characters. Initially, Dustin Hoffman had expressed interest in portraying Mario, but Arakawa didn't believe that he was the right man for the job. Apparently also, Danny DeVito was offered both the role of Mario and the director's mantle, but turned it down. Arnold Schwarzenegger and Michael Keaton were both approached to play Koopa, and both turned down the role, which makes sense for both at the time. At one point, Tom Hanks was actually considered for the role of Luigi, but a recent string of box office failures actually dropped him from consideration. It was at this point that Bob Hoskins and John Leguizamo were ultimately cast as Mario and Luigi. Hoskins openly, and has been very vocal about this over the years before his death, disliked the script and did not want to do another children's film. He says he had done Roger Rabbit, he'd done Hook, he did not want to become Dick Van Dyke. Hoskins wondered how he would prepare for a role like this and jokingly saying, "I'm the right shape. I've got a mustache. I worked as a plumber's apprentice for about 3 weeks and set the plumber's boots on fire with a blowtorch." But Roland Joffe didn't take no for an answer. In fact, he kept sending Hoskins new script revisions until Hoskins finally agreed to play the role. In fact, Jankel said about this, Bob was a no-brainer. Unabashed, shameless physical typecasting. Bob was brilliant at assuming the character in a slightly amplified way that would be in keeping with his supposed subsequent game iteration. For a character that never really talks, for a character that doesn't really have much of an arc in the games, sure. Why the hell not? What was really funny about this, though, is that Bob Hoskins did not know who Mario was. He had no knowledge of the game at all, and when he mentioned the film's title to his son immediately recognized it and then showed Hoskins the game on his Nintendo. So he got a crash course from a kid who was a fan. At least there's that. As for John Leguizamo, he did say about the movie, he says, "What I liked about the script was the adventure and the action that was involved." He joked that you always see a lot of Italians playing Latin people like Al Pacino did in Scarface. Now it's our turn in regards to a Latin man playing an Italian. Jankel did say about John, though, she says that John was brilliant up-and-coming stand-up comic. We went to see him at Second City, and we were 100% sold. He had a wonderful combination of empathy and irreverence, but was entirely without guile. It was not specifically scripted to be cast with a Hispanic or Latino actor, but it made perfect sense that the Mario brothers themselves should be this contemporary, unconventional family. So the small unit of just two couldn't be pegged as one thing or another. Now, granted, this happened in the early 90s before all the commentary surrounding woke casting would ever come into the lexicon of pop culture entertainment. And quite frankly, I'm glad that it did. I love the way the movie turned out. I love the actors. So not an issue at all. But what's really funny about all this is that the cast and crew hated Rocky Morton and Annabel Jankel for their allegedly obnoxious and controlling behaviors, their regular rewrites of the script, and for making changes to the film without telling each other or members of the production. The film crew would regularly refer to them with insulting nicknames and even had t-shirts made up that displayed rude comments made by the directors. Apparently, Bob Hoskins referred to them as the cock and the cow. At one point, Dennis Hopper, though, and this is apparently true, was so fed up with the drawn-out and constant changing production schedule that one day he spent nearly 3 hours yelling at the directors and holding up the filming of one scene in Koopa's bedroom. This altercation between Dennis Hopper and the directors and the producers was all about the dialogue for this one scene, and he wouldn't let it go. It got to be so bad that eventually the directors just told Dennis Hopper, "Fine, you rewrite the scene and we'll do that. If not, we're going to shoot it this way." And then he went, "Oh, okay, cool." And they went back to doing it. I don't quite know why, but like, he's been unabashedly open about he did the movie for money. So he didn't care. In fact, not a lot of people cared, but we're going to talk more about that here in a few minutes. Now, when it came to the design of Dino Hatton itself, the production designer David Snyder approached turning the Mushroom Kingdom into the live action setting by wanting to really kind of pervert the way that Koopa had seen New York in the beginning of the movie. So at the beginning of the movie, Koopa gets a single glimpse of Manhattan as he's chasing Daisy's mother. And from there, that inspires him to create Dino Hatton, but he didn't get it quite right because the place is twisted, off balance, different, and Koopa doesn't even know it, or maybe even care. He's in control. In the recently discovered extended cut of the movie, we do get to spend more time with Koopa in Manhattan in the beginning of the film while he's chasing Daisy's mother. Co-producer Fred Caruso is the one who located the deserted Ideal Cement Company plant in Wilmington, North Carolina. This was actually also previously used for Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and a couple of other films. He found this location to be a pretty unique opportunity, saying in this building, with all the existing concrete structure, we can hang the scenery from the structure and not have to build scaffolding, and could integrate the concrete structure into the film's design. In Blade Runner, a film that he actually was an art director on, the street was just one level. Here I have a street level, a pedestrian walkway, and above that Koopa's room, plus 6 or 7 stories in height. I have more flexibility in the layering of levels. It's a major, major opportunity. You'd never be able to do this on a soundstage. There isn't a soundstage big enough. We've designed this film with the idea of looking at New York while on some mind-altering drugs. And I would honestly say that they probably succeeded with that. Now, speaking of being inspired by the New York scene in the early 90s, Leguizamo said the directors really wanted to go there. Despite that this film was for 8-year-olds who play the game, and that's where the movie needed to be aimed at. But the directors really kept trying to insert new material. At one point, they shot scenes with strippers and had a lot of other sexually explicit content, which all ultimately got edited out anyway. I mean, I understand the idea of wanting to have options, but this is a kid's movie. You're not going to be selling an X-rated European cut. You know, it just seems so weird to me. But then again, if you ever spent any time in New York back in the day, it was very much like that. Hypersexualized, all the craziness. It took a long time to clean up Times Square. So the filming itself eventually did begin on May 6, 1992, and wrapped on July 27, 1992. Originally, it was only scheduled to film for about 10 weeks, but then it slugged into 15. No one, and I mean no one, thought that the movie had a smooth production, especially the actors. John Leguizamo has openly admitted that he began drinking with Bob Hoskins before shooting. This actually led to an accident where Leguizamo was drunk driving a van, and he slammed on the brakes too hard in one scene, and the van door slammed on Bob Hoskins' hands. You can actually see him wearing a pink cast in a couple of shots in the film. The funniest story, though, I think comes from Richard Edson, who played Spike. And he once said in an interview that he struck up friendships with other people working on the film. He says, "We would hang out a lot and get stoned. Bob Hoskins never would hang out. He had a mansion somewhere down the beach in Wilmington. But then one night we were talking about getting high, and Bob was like, 'You guys have pot? You've been smoking reefer?' And we're like, 'Yeah.' And he yelled, 'Why didn't you tell me? I've been sitting alone in my mansion.' We really looked up to him." And that's the kind of camaraderie you like to hear about on set, where the actors might hate their job, but at least they work well together. And I think that comes through on the screen really well. So after the filming commenced, this is where things got a little bit bad for Morton and Jankel, because the film's producers tried to cut them out of the picture. Leitmotiv had gotten two other production companies to buy into the film, pushing the budget to somewhere around $50 million. And now there were three sets of producers that had money at stake if the movie bombed. These producers felt that the film needed more action, so a second unit was set out to film a couple of those action sequences. Morton and Jankel weren't invited to any of those. And it only got worse for them after that. They were actually shut out of the editing bay completely. It got so bad that Morton had to reach out to the Directors Guild of America in order to come in and use the union to get him back in the editing room. I don't know what they cut out completely of the movie, but looking at the final cut, maybe wasn't the best. Now, Super Mario Bros. Finally did come out May 28th, 1993, and it came out, in my opinion, at a bad time because it was dominated by other box office giants like Jurassic Park and Mrs. Doubtfire. The film ultimately only grossed $20 million domestically throughout its entire run, which was half than what it cost to make. Globally, it only pulled in another $18 million, giving it a worldwide sum of roughly about $38 million. Taking into account the $50 million budget, the movie was a flop. I mean, critically, it wasn't any better either. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert did give it 2 thumbs down, citing tonal inconsistency and a lack of narrative, and the film was on their list for one of the worst films of 1993. But fans kind of liked it. CinemaScore gave it a B+, which is not perfect, but it's passable. And I think the film has developed quite a large cult following after the fact, so it's one that probably has been elevated since then. So the movie bombed. And what did Nintendo do? Nintendo did the most Nintendo thing imaginable. They killed any and all future live-action adaptations. At the time, a Metroid movie was in active development, but they decided to take it out back and Old Yeller it. Since then, they haven't done anything, and they don't even intend to in the future, even though it's been nearly 30 years and technology and attitudes have changed. But in regards to animation, it did get announced in 2018 that they had partnered with Illumination and Chris Melanandri to produce an animated Super Mario Bros. Movie that is currently on track to come out sometime in 2022. However, that actually wasn't the first time an animated Mario Bros. Movie had been kicked around. It came out back in 2014 during the Sony email hack that Tom Rothman and Avi Arad were actually discussing the idea. And I'm just going to say this, and I stand by this statement. Thank God that never happened. Truly, thank God that never happened. I'm okay with what Illumination is going to do with it. That's something I'm excited to see. But probably the most interesting aspect of this movie was just released a couple months ago in 2021. An unofficial extended cut of the movie, known as the Morton and Jankel cut, hit the internet with a few extended scenes and even a rap between Iggy and Spike. And I didn't put this in earlier, but I wanted to kind of tag this in at the end. One of the interesting facts about Iggy and Spike in this movie is that their dialogue was terrible. It was just terrible. So the first day they were on set, Fisher Stevens and Richard Edson decided that they wanted to rewrite their dialogue, and they just improvised everything. And apparently it went over so well with the producers that they were allowed to do that for every single scene. So if you are a fan of Iggy and Spike in the movie, you can thank those two actors for making them endearing enough to have a fan base all these years later. Perhaps the whole movie would have been better if everyone just would have approached it from that perspective. At the end of the day, Super Mario Bros. The movie is one that I adored as a kid. When the film ended on a cliffhanger, I was so excited for Super Mario Bros. 2, and I've always been bummed that it never made enough money to warrant a sequel. Granted, I was 11 years old at the time, so there'd be no way for me to know any of what went down. But here it is nearly 30 years later, and I would love to see some kind of continuation. That there was kind of. In the process of researching this episode, I came across the Super Mario Bros. 2 webcomic. This was actually something that was created back in 2013, and the people who are behind Super Mario Bros. The movie archive had a conversation with the original writer, Parker Bennett, and they were able to get a lot of information about how he wanted to plot out the sequel. So they turned it into a webcomic. It's the closest thing we have to a sequel. I haven't read it yet, but I need to. And the fact that it exists is pretty cool. And yeah, it's not official, but it's something. And that's honestly better than nothing. With any luck, we'll get a proper adaptation of this movie with the animated film coming out next year. But this one will always hold a special place in my heart. It's always a movie that I love, and I look forward to my kids being old enough to be able to sit down with them and watch it and have them appreciate it for the campiness that it is. Anyway, what are your thoughts on this? Let me know in the comment section here on YouTube. If you're listening to this on iTunes or Spotify, please leave a review. Find me on Twitter at mjarbo. I'll talk to you guys later. Have yourself a great day. Thank you again for listening to this episode of Podio Commentary, and peace out.